Our second inductive argument is the argument from or by example. As you might guess from the name, this argument involves establishing a claim, trying to prove the claim by providing examples that support that claim. And the general strength of this argument depends on the quality and number of the examples. Now, in normal everyday life, people would not follow the formal form here. They would just present examples and then present their conclusion, or present their conclusion then back it up with examples. For example, if you have a political candidate who claims to have, say, experience in foreign policy, the way they might argue for that with an argument by example is giving examples of all their foreign policy experience. And they, again, in a normal scenario, they wouldn't lay out, premise 1, premise 2, etc. They would just, talk about their experience and then draw the conclusion. But what does the formal version look like? Well, the formal version looks like this. Premise 1 would present the first example, and it would be example 1 is an example that supports claim P. Then premise 2, example 2 is an example that supports claim P. And then premise N, where N is some number, example N is an example that supports claim P. And then you conclude claim P is true. Now this is just a kind of a template version, and so when you're making an argument by example or you see ones out in the real world, they may have more than 3 examples. In fact, they probably should, or they may have less, even though that would be bad. And again, when people present this kind of normally, they would not say premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, etc. They would just draw their conclusion and say, for example, I have lots of foreign policy experience, for example, and then give examples. So that is the formal form. So how do you tell when you've got a good argument from or by example? Well, it has the following standards. First, the more examples, the stronger the argument. If you're trying to prove something, or someone's trying to prove something by examples, the more examples there are, the better. So, for example, if I was a politician and I claimed I had foreign policy experience, the more examples I provide, the better. If I only have one example, not so good. If I have lots of examples, then that would be good. Now, merely having lots of examples is not enough. The examples must also be relevant. So the more relevant the examples, the stronger the argument. So, for example, suppose I'm a politician running for office, and I claim I have foreign policy experience. And when pressed on this, I say, well, I went to Canada, one time, and I've seen some foreign films. And obviously those would be pretty stupid because they're not very relevant. Now, whether something is relevant or not can be a matter of considerable debate. For example, to use an example outside of philosophy, suppose you have a politician running for office, and they claim they're well qualified for office because they have plenty of experience in business. And it'd be a matter of debate whether business experience is relevant to being competent in a political office. For example, if I was running for office and said, well, I've never held political office, but I've taught a lot of philosophy classes, so clearly I'm qualified. Some may say, well, I guess teaching involves organizing stuff, so that would be kind of relevant. But other people may disagree and say that, experience teaching philosophy, even if you have to organize classes, is very different from political experience. And so there can be considerable debate about whether an example is relevant or not. And this can be a good faith debate where people are honestly disagreeing and actually have reasons for it. It can also, of course, be done badly in bad faith, where people simply, refuse to accept the relevance, or in the opposite way, simply insist they're relevant without any good reasons. Thirdly, the examples must be specific and clearly identified. Because if someone just says, going back to the politician example, if I say, I'm running for office, I have lots of foreign policy experience, all that foreign policy stuff I did, that would obviously be pretty terrible. So the examples need to be specific and identified. In many cases, this is a practical concern because you want to be able to check on them, to see if the examples are in fact true. And this is especially true in this age of, fake news, when people give examples of when they're attacking, say, a politician they don't like or a person they don't like, and they give all these examples. They need to be clearly identified so you can go and check and confirm the source. And more on sources when you talk about argument from authority. Fourthly, counterexamples must be considered. And a counterexample is an example that, surprisingly enough, counts against the claim. Now, the more counterexamples there are, and the more relevant they are, the weaker the argument. So more examples makes an argument stronger. More relevance makes an argument stronger. The more specific and identified the arguments are, the better. But counterexamples count against it. So the greater the number and the relevance of the counterexamples, the weaker the argument. Now, just as with an argument by analogy, you might wonder, why would I bring up counterexamples? Well, again, the reason is in philosophy the goal is truth, so you'd want to be honest. You'd want to bring up counterexamples against your own argument because that's honest. Also, from the standpoint of practicality, you can actually make a stronger case, somewhat ironically, by considering counterexamples, because you show the person hearing your argument or reading it that you've considered counters to your view, which shows that that you're reasonable. And also, as I mentioned before, the argument by analogy, if you bring up counterexamples on your own when you're in control of them, you have control of them, so you're better able to handle them. So those are the 4 standards. What would be an example of an argument by the example? Well, one way to make an argument by example would be like the example I gave of the politician. If someone wanted to prove that they had foreign policy experience, they would list examples of this. If someone is applying for a job and they want to show that they're qualified, they give examples of, say, the relevant experience they had. Now, philosophically, the way this is typically used, as you might imagine, is coming up with examples that are relevant for the claim that you're making. And that would, of course, vary depending on what you're trying to do. So that is the argument from or by example. The argument from authority. Since no person today can be an expert at everything, or even many things, we often have to rely on authorities or experts. And an argument from authority involves, not surprisingly, making use of authority or experts. Now, in this case, the authority is not like a political authority. It's not that, some grand leader or, beloved leader for a citizen somehow is more correct about things. It's authority in the terms of expertise. That is to say, knowing things and having appropriate, skills. So what is an argument from authority? Well, by definition, it's an argument in which the conclusion is supported by citing an authority. Again, an expert, not like a political authority. And the strength of the support depends on the quality of the authority. Now, even a good argument from authority is still relatively weak, because essentially what you're saying is this claim is true because an expert says it's true, and they're probably right because they're an expert. Now, as I noted, they're often used when a person lacks the knowledge or expertise, and they need to rely on an outside source. So, for example, I'm not an expert on climate change. So when I want to, believe true things about climate change, I turn to the scientific experts. As another example, I'm not an expert on pandemics and, how to avoid becoming a victim of one. So I turn to the people who are medical experts, who are experts on pandemics, viruses, and health. We also use them in cases where we are an expert ourselves, because they can add extra weight to our position. So this is why people who are experts often also cite other experts, because it adds weight to their claims. And arguments from authority are often used as part of a larger argument, especially in philosophy, although you could argue that something is true because some philosophers, say Kant or Plato, said it. The weak point there is that there are many great philosophers who are considered, authorities in philosophy, but they disagree. So for any authority you could cite in philosophy, you can find typically an equally credible, equally, established philosophical authority that says the exact opposite. So what's the form formally speaking, of the argument from authority. And again, these forms are not how people would talk or write normally, but they lay out, in a clear manner, the structure of the argument. So premise 1, person A is an authority on subject S. Premise 2, person A makes claim C about subject S. Conclusion, therefore, claim C is true. So the idea is the person's an authority, they make a claim in the subject, therefore their claim is true. So how do you tell when you've got a good argument from authority? Well, the assessment involves the following standards. First, and quite obviously, the person must have sufficient expertise in this subject. This can involve formal education. For example, if a person has a medical degree and they're an expert at viruses and pandemics, then they would have sufficient expertise in the subject. If a person is just a person who's run some businesses, no medical experience, and they're making medical claims, they lack sufficient expertise in this subject. Now again, the education could be formal, like a PhD or a medical degree, or may be on the basis of experience, because perhaps there's no degree in that area, or the person has enough experience to be competent. And this can be a matter of considerable debate as to what counts as sufficient expertise. Secondly, an expert has to be making the claim within their area of expertise. A person could be an expert in one area, but if they're speaking in an area outside of their expertise, getting out of their lane, as people say, their claim doesn't get credibility because of their expertise in another area. For example, if you have someone who's a skilled actor, a brilliant actor winning many awards, and they're talking about politics or medical issues, it doesn't mean they're wrong, but expertise in acting does not confer expertise, say, in politics. It doesn't confer expertise in medical fields. As another example, my expertise in philosophy gives me expertise in, philosophy, but if I try to do an argument from authority in physics or chemistry or engineering, they would obviously be bad because those are not my areas of expertise. Now, a person who's an expert in one area could master another area, but until they do, they're not an expert. And as you might imagine, people often think that because a person is a celebrity or famous or successful or well-known in one area, that somehow this qualifies them to be an expert in some other area. So again, going back to the example of celebrities, they're often asked their opinions on all kinds of things they have no expertise in. It doesn't mean they're wrong, it just means that it doesn't make any good logical sense to try to, believe a claim just because someone who is famous or a celebrity in some other field makes a claim about it. Again, it's not to say they're wrong, it's just that if an actor is talking about physics or politics, they should not be regarded as an expert. Now, a person can have multiple areas of expertise. For example, there could be an actor who also has a PhD in, chemistry. So what they say about chemistry would be credible. Or you could have an actor who is experienced in politics and knows a lot about it and hence would be credible. Third, there's got to be adequate agreement among the experts. Because when you rely on an argument from authority, what you're counting on is that the authority is probably right. And if the majority of qualified experts agree, and this expert agrees with them, then they're probably right. Not guaranteed, though. The majority of experts could turn out to be wrong, because an argument by authority is inductive, and scientific reasoning and most reasoning is inductive as well. So the majority of experts could turn out to be mistaken. It's happened historically. But in general, the majority of the experts in a field are correct. And of course, if you're not an expert yourself, they're the best bet, because if one lone expert or a few experts say something and the majority of experts disagree, if one is not an expert oneself, how do you decide which ones somehow have it right? And in general, the majority opinion of the qualified experts is probably correct. Although they could be wrong, but the rational choice is to go with the majority of experts, unless you yourself are an expert, in which case you could make a case against them if you disagree. To give a concrete example, although climate change has been made into a political issue in fairly recent years, the majority of qualified experts say it is a real thing, and being rational and teaching, argument from authority, I believe their claim. There are people who claim that it's not occurring, but the majority of qualified experts claim that it is. So from the standpoint of logic, that's the more rational thing to believe. Could they be wrong? Yes, that's possible. Are they probably right? Yes, that's the better bet. Fifth, the area of expertise has got to be a legitimate area or discipline. So if someone has an expertise in chemistry or, an expert at, infectious diseases, those are legitimate areas. Now, if someone claims expertise in something like healing crystals or ufology, then there can be a debate about whether it's legitimate or not. And as you might imagine, there can be rather heated disputes about what is a legitimate field and what's not. And the history of academics and science does show fields that were once considered kind of sketchy and dubious, like psychology, for example, or economics, that eventually do become what are regarded as legitimate areas. 6, the authority must be properly identified and properly cited. This typically requires citing a source. So if someone simply says, they say, or experts say, or people say, not adequate. There's also, one I unfortunately skipped over, the fourth one. The expert is not significantly biased. Now, if an expert is biased, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily wrong. But if someone has an interest in the matter or they're biased in some way, it reduces their credibility. For example, if you have a person who's an expert at politics, but they're a devout Democrat, and they're talking about how good, to use a current example, Joe Biden is, then you'd want to be suspicious, because if they're a devoted Democrat, they're likely to be biased. Likewise, if you have an expert in politics assessing, the presidency, but they're a devoted Republican, and they say Trump is really good, you'd also want to be suspicious, because they would be biased. Now, biased, again, doesn't mean that someone is wrong. A person can be biased and say true things, but it reduces the person's credibility, because they have a reason to say something different. Now, getting back to properly identifying the authority, one thing that often occurs in reporting today is anonymous sources. They'll say, for example, sources close to the president say, blah, 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 or sources close to the candidate say, or they say, and this is often done in some cases for good reasoning, because if a journalist is giving away a source, say inside the White House, leaking damaging information, if they identify that person, they could get in trouble. They could, in fact, face possible legal consequences. So there are legitimate reasons to use anonymous sources. However, you should always be cautious about anonymous sources, even from credible, journalists. Why? Well, because you can't check the expertise of the source they're citing because you don't know what it is. So you're doing kind of a double argument from authority. You're relying on the expertise of the journalist or the person, writing or creating the work to assess the qualifications of the person that they're citing. So you're putting your confidence in the journalist's expertise and assessing the expertise of someone you don't know who they are. And again, sometimes this is the only option, but it does make for a fairly weak argument. Now, in philosophy, arguments from authority, as I mentioned in the intro to it, typically wouldn't be this is true because this philosopher, say Kant or Plato, says it. Because for every claim made by a philosopher, there's typically an equally, famous, established, great philosopher that says something the opposite. So, for example, Kant says morality, should be based on rationality. Mill endorses a consequentialist position, and other people endorse, like Aristotle endorses a virtue position. Aristotle, Kant, and Mill, all big philosophers, but they all disagree. So typically to use an argument from authority in philosophy, not to say this is true because a philosopher says it, but in another context. So for example, if you were doing the subject of time travel and doing the grandfather paradox, you might cite an authority in physics who's written about this as part of your argument. And so typically in philosophy, you don't appeal to the authority of philosophers to say things are true. You would appeal to the authority of an expert to support a claim that you use in your argument. So that's the argument from authority. And next we'll turn to our final inductive argument, the appeal to intuition. The appeal to intuition is also an inductive argument, which means that the premises, even if they are true, at best make the conclusion likely to be true. So what is an intuition? Well, an intuition is a blend of how you think and feel about a matter prior to reflection. Crudely put, it's sort of a gut reaction. Now, the goal of the appeal to intuition as an argument is to motivate the reader's intuitions so that they accept your position on the issue. The argument is thus something of a blend between persuasion and argumentation. Now, persuasion involves trying to get people to accept a claim as true, whether it's true or not, typically through various means that appeal to emotions, but not always. In an argument, at least philosophically, the goal is to establish the truth of the conclusion. So an appeal to intuition blends those together. So the goal, ultimately, is to support a position through reason. But the goal is also to get the audience to accept your view because you presented something that appeals to their intuitions. Now, there are a couple methods of this method. One is the very basic method, which is the simplest and weakest, which is this: to show that something violates or coincides with our intuitions and conclude that it's therefore, if it goes against our two intuitions, incorrect or implausible or wrong, or if it goes with our intuitions, correct, plausible, or right. The simplest method of this is to say intuitively, comma, followed by whatever you're claiming. And that rests entirely on people's intuitions, and you could make a pretty good case it's not an argument at all, because you're just saying intuitively, blah, blah, blah. So probably not an argument in that case. So someone might say, intuitively, mass murder is wrong. And they're probably relying, and most likely correctly, on people's shared intuitions that mass murder is wrong. And in many ways, using the term intuitively, the phrase intuitively, comma, whatever you're saying, is pretty non-argumentative. But it is technically using this method, and it can be appealing. So what's a better method? Well, the next step up is a story method, where you present a plausible and appealing story or scenario that aims at motivating the target's intuitions towards your position on the issue. So essentially you tell a story that goes the way you want it to go. And this can be quite effective. People do like narratives and stories far better than, say, laying out, sort of dry arguments. And so the idea is to tell a story that appeals to the intuitions of your audience. Now, the obvious weak point of telling this story is that, again, it's really not an argument, that you're telling a story. And of course, the way a story ends is always up to the author. It's kind of like the thing kids would ask about superheroes. Who would win if the Hulk and Superman fought? And kind of the cynical answer would be, well, it's whatever the writers say. That's how it ends, because it's just, that's their story. So how do you make an appeal to intuition into an actual argument? Well, the next step up is, after presenting your plausible and appealing story or scenario that tries to move the intuitions of your audience in your direction, or tries to simply appeal to their existing intuitions to show how your view meshes with theirs, is to, after you give the story, the narrative, you give arguments that shows the reader why the story or scenario actually rationally supports your position. And so it would be the story plus actual argument. Now in metaphysics, not surprisingly, people rely on appeals to intuitions quite a bit, because you would present a scenario, and since you can't actually typically conduct, obviously a real experience in metaphysics, you try to tell a story that is appealing, and then to develop it more, present an argument at the end. For example, suppose you were talking about personal identity and trying to show that people could survive their physical deaths. And one thing you might do is tell a story about, you make up kind of a science fiction story, which, they're a fairly common subject in science fiction, where a person, invents a way to copy memories and personality onto a computer. And you could tell a story about how a person is, copied onto this computer, their memories, etc., and personality. And then after they die, those memories live on, the personality lives on. So if you talk to that entity, it answers the questions the same way as the original. And you try to appeal to people's intuitions to think that that would be the person. Now, of course, you could also run a counter, intuition, saying that just because something seems to remember that it was you, to use an analogy, if someone had access to, all your Facebook information and all the videos, and say you kept like a journal and all your stuff there, the mere fact that someone knows all the stuff that's in, say, your journal, your Facebook, etc., you could say that intuitively that wouldn't make them you. And so you could say that just because something has your memories and can cite facts about you and say, oh yeah, I remember when I did that, because it has, say, your journal, you could say intuitively it need not be you. Just like with the analogy, if someone somehow has access to, say, your private journal, your Facebook, all your messages, email, phone conversations, etc., they could pretend to be you. They could steal your identity, but you would probably intuitively say that would not be you. So that would be the appeal to intuition with the story, with the argument by analogy as the actual argument. Now, if you like telling stories and narratives, it's a very good method to use, because then writing or talking about it can be more enjoyable than just kind of assembling what may be considered a dry and dull argument. So how do you tell when you get a good appeal to intuition? Well, essentially there are two standards. In terms of the persuasion, it is, did you persuade the person, the target? In terms of the argument part, did the premises support the conclusion well? And typically the argument part of the appeal to intuition will be a separate type of argument, like very commonly the argument by analogy or analogical argument. So that takes us to the end of the argument basics, our brief tour of arguments. And again, for the paper, you don't have to use all of these argument types, and in fact you don't have to use any of them. You do have to argue in the paper, and there is a separate video that goes on at length about how to do the paper. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.